So a few months ago, I was sent a list by one of my subscribers, which consisted of a list of all of his different various issues with the gaming industry as it exists in the modern day. And it was quite extensive. And reading over some of the list, it didn't really open my eyes per se because I already knew most of this stuff. I've talked about a lot of this stuff on the channel in the past. Things like microtransactions, loot boxes, games as a service. I've definitely have gone over that. Remakes, remasters, different things such as that. No innovation. Day one DLC, the size of various games, buggy unfinished releases, day one patches, and all of that. I've spoken about a lot of these things before. But his question really was for the older generation. It was for people who I assume are age probably, I don't want to say 30 and up, so I'll say probably 35 or older, who still play video games and what have you, but are just frustrated and just fed up with the way the modern industry has changed to what it is now. I didn't really know for the longest time how to actually go about this video because I didn't know exactly what angle that I wanted to come at it, as far as the video topic goes. So what I landed on was the response. What response should you have as an older player to the modern gaming industry as it exists today? And I've come up with, a rather small list of different things that you can do to offset a lot of these issues that the gaming industry has. And really, anyone can do this. It's not just the older generation, but primarily, exclusively, I'm making this video for the older players that are out there. How should you respond to the nonsense that we have in today's modern video game industry? Naturally, there's a lot of different ways that you can respond, and there's a lot of different things that you can do to maintain a more positive attitude on the industry itself. But I'm going to go down a list of exactly five different things that you can do to offset the issues with the industry. So the first thing that you can do is to stop buying games day one. Instead of purchasing games day one as soon as they're available for mass market release, instead what you should do is wait for a sale. And I'm going to explain why you should wait for a sale. Modern video games now are typically, not always, but a good majority of the time, they're rushed. The reason they're rushed is because the studios, and when I say these studios, I'm talking about the actual development studios that make the games, as well as the gaming publishers that actually produce the games and make them available to, a wide audience. These companies have to work with deadlines, okay? So whenever a video game production is commenced, these companies have an X amount of time to get Y amount of content finished, if that makes sense. And I'm not trying to get too technical, too theoretical, but that's typically the way it works. It's no different from a movie production, a film production. You have this amount of time to get this done, and it has to be done in this amount of time. And they are given a specific budget to work with. They are given a very specific team with a very specified number of employees to work with. And these companies, they can actually make things easier on themselves by being more prepared to execute the steps that need to be taken in order to get the production made, right? To see that the production goes smoothly as it possibly can be. And they can do that by hiring more hands. They can do that by outsourcing. They can do that by developing assets in a very specified manner. They can do that by using a specific engine for the type of game that they're trying to make. And so there's a lot of different contributing factors. But the point is that these companies have a very specific deadline to work with. And because they have a very specific deadline to work with, not everything is going to come out the way it should on release day. This is why games have day one patches. However, my problem with day one patches is that these companies have started to rely on them to bail themselves out of what is really a lazy effort when it comes to video games being released on day one. This is why you should wait, because virtually every single game now receives a long list of patch updates that address various issues that's wrong with the game in order to improve the game. If you buy a game day one, you may end up hating the game, and then down the line, even if the game is improved, you may not want to go back to that game because you got a very bad first impression. And we've seen games that have done this before. Star Wars Battlefront 2 is a perfect example. I've read comments online that people will not go back and play that game as great as it is now, because when they played it the first time, they had issues with it the first time when it first came out, so they don't want to go back and play the most recent version of the game. The same thing happened with No Man's Sky. Virtually every single RPG that exists on the market now has gone through the same thing. So typically, it's always best to wait for a sale. Although, I wouldn't wait too long, right? You don't want to wait a year to play a specific game, right? I would say give it 6 months. If the game still isn't right after 6 months, like say the game was released in a very poor state, or not all the content that should have been there the first time around on day one was there, and so you have to wait for certain updates to take place. After 6 months, if those updates still aren't there, then the development team is bullshit. They're playing games, and you should not reward them by purchasing their game. So that's, the first step, or one of the things that you can do to offset some of that nonsense when it comes to patch updates, day one patches, games being released unfinished, publishers lying, saying that their product is going to be one way, but then the final product turns out to be something completely different. This is how you can offset some of that disappointment. Stop buying games day one. So the second thing that you can do in order to offset some of the disappointment, it goes without saying that modern video games are not nearly as good as games that came out 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Modern video games now come with a certain level of been there, done that. There's very little innovation in the industry now. That's why we're seeing a lot of remasters and remakes and what have you, because the newer ideas always feel like something that's already been done before, because it typically is something that's already been done before and something that's been done better before. And this is how we get a lot of jaded players in the industry. This is how we get a lot of players that say X game is boring, or Y game is something that they've already played before, That's how we get players like that. In order to offset that, you have to expand your horizons. And the best way to do that would be to play more indie titles. Play more indie games. Indie games are good for you. Some people like indie games more than others. I find myself to be very neutral with them, very 50-50. I think personally that indie games are a good gateway to getting away from the AAA space, but they're not a permanent solution to some of the issues that I just mentioned. Now, we've had a lot of great indie titles, right? But there's a lot of mediocre indie games as well. They call them shovelware, games that no one should ever really play, especially on the PC platform. There's literally hundreds to thousands of shovelware that's out there. So you kind of have to pay attention to the industry to understand what is actually worth your time and what isn't. And even then, everyone has different tastes. One man's trash is another man's treasure, that sort of thing. One game may not work for you that's very popular, but another game that's less popular may be more your style. That's just how it goes. So playing more indie games will definitely help alleviate that feeling of there being no diversity when it comes to video games. There being no innovation when it comes to playing video games. Because if all you do is play AAA games all the time, eventually you're going to get to that point where you feel like you've done everything that you can possibly do. Hell, myself, I have well over 300 games on Steam, and most of those games are AAA games. Either older AAA games from the 7th generation or more recent AAA games from the 8th generation. There's only so many AAA games that are out there because AAA games, they take millions of dollars to produce. They take entire development teams to produce. They take years to produce. So once you've gone through the majority or the bulk of the AAA games that are available on the market, you're going to want to try and offset that. Play smaller games. And I say the same thing with movies, right? You don't want to watch blockbusters all the time. Some of the best movies that are out there are indie films, films that are not backed by a major studio. The same concept goes with video games. So that's the second thing that you can do. The third thing is to take up a rental service. When I say rental service, I'm talking about something like GameFly, for example. Now, I've had my issues with GameFly. GameFly is certainly not perfect. At one point, I thought about making a video about GameFly, but I guess I just never really saw the point of making an entire video talking about GameFly. But, you know, some of the issues I've had with GameFly in the past, they'll be out of a particular game, you know, out of stock that you want to play, but you always have a queue in the system, so it automatically goes to the next game that you might not want to play at that point in time, which is actually kind of a problem because GameFly is no different from paying for a streaming service. So you'll always want to have a game in your queue. But then another issue that I've had with GameFly is that they will send you a game that does not work. You know, the disc doesn't work because whoever had the disc last did something they probably shouldn't have done with it, and for whatever reason, the disc doesn't work. But thankfully, we have other services now other than GameFly. We also have Game Pass. You know, we have Xbox Game Pass. Now we have PC Game Pass, which is really just Xbox Game Pass that's been renamed to PC Game Pass. So that's another option. And then we also have PlayStation Now, although I have issues with PlayStation Now. PlayStation Now has never been on the same level as Xbox Game Pass. But the point is we have various services now where you can rent video games, where you can stream video games digitally. And not just older games, but newer games that release to market, to where you're not really spending a large sum of money in order to get these experiences. So that's another way that you can offset some of the nonsense when it comes to pricing in the modern gaming industry. The fourth thing that you can do to respond to the modern gaming industry as it exists today is to support companies that you know are going to deliver quality titles. Now, it goes without saying that video games can be viewed as an art. You know, after all, they're made by artists. There's nothing artistic about playing video games itself, but video games are art. They're literally pieces of art that hundreds of people work on. And no artist is perfect, right? No group of artists is perfect. Like anyone else, artists are just people, and people can make mistakes. You can have someone that can make a great game that's beloved, and you can have that same person that made that great game that's beloved make a complete piece of shit. I think the best example when it comes to video games that I can think of would be Hideo Kojima. Very few would say that the Metal Gear games, as a whole, collectively, are bad games. They may be games that's not exactly for you, but for the most part, the Metal Gear Solid games are good games. They're good games. However, Hideo Kojima has made bad games in the past. He's made bad games recently, including Metal Gear Solid 5, which was abysmally awful, including Death Stranding, which was even worse. We have Naughty Dog. Naughty Dog makes great games, right? But then they made something called The Last of Us Part 2 that a lot of people hated, including myself. We have great development studios that typically make great games, like NetherRealm Studios. But then NetherRealm Studios made Mortal Kombat 11, which is one of the worst pieces of shit that I've ever played in my life. But that's just another example. There's dozens of examples. Anyone can make a bad game. Any one of these companies can make a bad game. But just the same as they can make a bad game, they can also make a good game or a great game. The trick is to stick with companies that typically put out good material. For me, Insomniac Games can do almost no wrong. They've only made one questionable game. Okay, well, two questionable games in the history of their studio that weren't that great. But everything else they've touched is fantastic. Whenever Insomniac Games announces a new game, or a new game is announced from Sony, Insomniac Games has been announced to be the developer, at that point I know that there's a high chance that I'm going to get something special. The same goes with Sucker Punch. Then you also have companies that do change over time that make pretty poor decisions, such as BioWare or Naughty Dog. And that just comes with change in staff. You have people within these companies, big names, that leave. They're replaced with someone who's not as experienced or someone who has a very different mindset. And that does show in, the future titles that a studio produces. It's like listening to a music artist, be it a solo performer or a band. Music artists, they change over time. You may have liked their old material, or you may not like or even hate their new material. But that's to be expected because people change over time. Especially artistically, people change over time. Tastes within of themselves change over time. So you got to pay attention to the studios that you do like, and pay attention when someone says that they're out and that they've left the company to pursue other interests. This commonly happens in the games industry all the time. There's always someone important that's a big name at a particular studio that's left to make something new. It happens all the time. But that's just a rule of thumb. Stick to companies, or at least try to stick to companies that you have a good feeling that, whatever they try and do, whatever they strive to achieve, they will give you a good experience. They will give you your money's worth. And so the last thing on the list is, if you see a bad deal, don't take it. Use some common sense. So, for example, and I've been meaning to make a video about this, a separate video about this. A recent game that's coming out within the next few months that I'm very much looking forward to playing, which is the Callisto Protocol by Dead Space creator Glenn Schofield. That game on all platforms is $60, with the exception of the PlayStation 5 version. For whatever random reason, the Callisto Protocol on PlayStation 5 is $70. Yet they are not adding any new content or any exclusive content whatsoever to the PlayStation 5 version of the game. So why would you buy the game on PlayStation 5 unless that's the only thing that you have? That's the only platform that you have. It would actually make more sense to buy the game on a different platform, be it like PC or PlayStation 4 or something of that nature. So you got to pay attention to the deals that these publishers give their consumer base. And this is just another part of how to offset pricing issues with video games in the modern industry. And just going off of, some of the other things that's listed here. For example, dislocked content or content blocked via paywalls. This is why I made that video a few months ago saying that buying video games digitally is actually better than buying games physically, because you don't have to worry about dislocked content on something that's digital. In fact, most video games these days are actually sold digitally at a much higher rate compared to their physical counterparts. And that's fact. They got the numbers and the statistics to prove it. And just taking another pick from the list, shitty and paid for shills and journalists. So when it comes to, gaming journalists, just about all of them now are crap. So the only way I personally pay attention to gaming journalists now is by a collective whole. If you have a long, list of gaming journalists that say a particular game is bad, and that game is not getting a lot of high scores, and it's getting a lot of mediocre scores, then it's probably a bad game. And there's quite a few examples from over the last few years of games that have had this issue. I think the one that comes to mind the most for me would be Jump Force. I made quite a bit of content talking about Jump Force and how excited I was for Jump Force before that game came out. But then when the reviews came out for it, I actually had canceled my pre-order and I decided to get Metro Exodus instead. And even though I didn't like Metro Exodus either, for various reasons, I knew that Metro Exodus was a much better game than Jump Force. And of course, this is why we have YouTubers, and this is why we have people that write blogs, and this is why we have people that write their own reviews, although you got to be careful with those things that I just listed as well, because there's a lot of stupidity that's out there. Basically, you got to have common sense to listen to people that know what the hell they're talking about. I'm going to pick something else from the list, which is the point that was made about memory file size and gigabytes a game can take to run or install. He said, what's next? Terabyte-sized games? LOL. And that's actually funny because I believe Jade Raymond, the famous producer who produced the first Assassin's Creed and several of the Assassin's Creed games, her current studio, is actually trying to make a terabyte-sized game. There is no reason why any video game ever should be that size. In my humble opinion, there's no reason why a video game should ever be that large. But I digress. The main thing that you can do to offset games that are big in size like that, and I'm talking about games like Star Wars Battlefront 2, games such as Final Fantasy VII Remake, games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, games that are, approaching 100 gigabytes in size, the way you offset that is by buying an external hard drive. One that is a few terabytes in size. A 2 terabyte external hard drive will pretty much guarantee that you'll be able to fit just about all the games that you play up on there, depending on how much you play video games. If you don't play video games a whole lot, then you don't need anything that's above 2 terabytes in size. But if you're someone like me who plays probably around 10 to 12 games a year, depending on the year and depending on what actually comes out, then you're going to want to buy a larger hard drive. So, that's a solution to that problem. And of course, we have other things such as games that are free to play. Those gacha games like Genshin Impact. I believe that's what that game's called. Well, you can choose to ignore the free to play games. For the people watching this, if you noticed, I've actually have never talked about games that are free to play because I don't play games that are free to play. Games that are free to play, quality-wise, in my opinion, are no better than mobile games. So, I just don't play them. And because I don't play them, I don't cover them on the channel. That's just the way that goes. And of course, if you stay away from social media, like how it's mentioned about Twitter right here, well, you will avoid a lot of issues, a lot of mental trauma in life if you ignore social media. I, for one, don't have a Twitter, for example. I've never used Twitter like that. I've been on Twitter, but only for maybe 2 minutes at the most, and that's it. I don't actually use Twitter, so I'm not really concerned with what goes on with that company. But basically, you got to pay attention to certain things in order to offset some of the more negative points about the gaming industry. But now I'm going to move into the second part of the video, which is, let's say you've just, for whatever reason, have gotten so fed up with the gaming industry that you just don't even really want to play video games anymore, or whenever you do play a video game, it just angers you, it just pisses you off. Or you are playing a video game and it's just not going the way that you want it to go and you're just getting frustrated. How should you respond in that situation? Well, the answer is very simple. You need to have other hobbies, be it outdoors or indoors. And of course, some of your outdoor hobbies include hiking, fishing, going to the range, engaging in a sport, Dating, although if you consider dating to be a hobby, something is probably not right upstairs. Just saying. Going to the movies, going to a restaurant, traveling, basic things, right? Now, when it comes to indoor hobbies, well, there's a lot of different things that you can do indoors. I'm going to use myself as an example, and I do have some very diverse hobbies, and I'm going to go down a list of them right now.
So, YouTube is obviously a hobby of mine that's, I don't feel that I need to really go into that one. But I also have other hobbies as well, including drawing. So, this is a drawing that I had done a few years ago. Then I also have other drawings that I've done recently. I've done this, I did this one about maybe 2 weeks ago. It's not finished. Yeah, I was working on that. It took me around 2 hours. And then I have another one here that I was working on. And yeah, I really like the way that one turned out. But yeah, I'm pretty good at drawing people and have been for a long time. Been drawing for years. And I haven't received any formal training or anything, but I did take some art class in the past, although that's not really where I get my techniques from. Yeah, that's one of my hobbies is drawing. Another hobby of mine is playing guitar, and I actually have a digital tuner right here to tune the strings, a Line 6 amplifier. That's one of the best amplifiers that you can buy. And yeah, I need to play more often, but I have other important things that I have to do at the moment with my time. So when I get more time, I will play more. So this is another one of my hobbies, which is to make music. I've written at least 2 records purely through Guitar Pro, and I'm looking to write a third and an inevitable fourth record using the same program. In fact, they just came out with Guitar Pro 8 recently, and I did invest in that. But yeah, I don't really make music too often, but when I do, I usually put in, invest in a lot of time into the hobby itself. It's just very time consuming, and there's a lot of thinking that goes into it. So that's primarily why I don't do it too often. But it is another good way to pass the time. Lastly, my final major creative hobby is actually writing screenplays. I have a few that I've written thus far, and one of those I plan on entering into a few screenplay contests next year. But yeah, if I'm not really making YouTube videos, I'm probably doing something such as this. It's a great way to pass the time, personally.
All right, so that is the video. That's the list of different things that you can do in order to respond to the modern gaming industry. And at the end of the day, if it gets too bad and you just feel like you can't put up with the nonsense anymore, I mean, you can always quit the hobby. But, just to circumvent that, there's few steps that I went over that you can practice in order to make gaming a bit more tolerable. And I do want to give a shout out to the person who sent me that list. There were a lot of good points made on that list. And anyone else who has a good video idea for me. I'll definitely review thoughts on any video topic and go from there. And I've gotten some good ones. So I'll probably be looking into those at some point sooner or later.